This screencast is intended for teachers of 4th grade social studies to aid in the teaching of the Georgia Standards of Excellence. Element C of our Westward Expansion Standard focuses on the regions west of the Mississippi River. Specifically, the region between the Continental Divide and the Mississippi River, known as Louisiana, though the region we will be discussing is much bigger than what we know of as Louisiana today. We will also look at the rough and rugged lands the brave and daring Lewis and Clark explored and opened up to settlers, as well as the interesting history of how Texas shifted from Spanish control to a U.S. territory. Finally, we will work our way to the West Coast with a brief trip on the Oregon Trail and how the promise of gold in California and Alaska fueled the dreams that brought many to our western shore in hopes of great riches. We will not be covering the westward growth in elements A and B, which deal with the War of 1812 and the Northwest Territory. And while we may think of that as Washington and Oregon, which we will be covering here, back then, the Great Lakes region was essentially the Northwest Territory, and so that is covered in another screencast for regions east of the Mississippi. When studying the Louisiana Purchase, we must first clarify that the region we are talking about is much, much larger than the current state of Louisiana our students may be familiar with. The region we are talking about includes all of the land from the Mississippi River to the Great Continental Divide in the Rocky Mountains, as well as everything north to south from our border with Canada to the port of New Orleans on the Gulf of Mexico, literally spanning the entire width top to bottom of our country. This is over 828,000 square miles. To understand the Louisiana Purchase, we must once again go back to the French and Indian War, as this region was originally claimed by France as a part of New France, as they called it. When France lost the French and Indian War, this region was ceded to Spain as a part of the negotiations for peace. You see, Spain had joined sides with France and wanted some concessions in order for them to sign the treaty. But Spain did very little with the land once they got it, other than set up some Spanish missions in an attempt to convert the American Indians in the region to Catholicism. Fast forward to the years just before the War of 1812, and we find England and France once again fighting, this time in the Napoleonic Wars, and Spain once again siding with France. At this time, Spain gave the Louisiana region back to France, which made Americans very nervous to say the least, especially as we had come to rely on the mighty Mississippi River to transport goods from our heartland to the Gulf of Mexico. President Thomas Jefferson asked our minister to France to attempt to purchase the all-important port of New Orleans. You can imagine his surprise when Napoleon offered to sell us the entire territory. Needless to say, we didn't look a gift horse in the mouth and ask why. But it is most likely that Napoleon had his hands full with England and his colony in Haiti, among other things, and wars can be quite costly to fund, and they had not had active colonies over here for decades. Regardless of his reasons, the United States snapped up this golden opportunity to the tune of $11.25 million. Now, to 4th graders, that will sound like a lot of money, so let's do a little land shopping. That same amount of money would buy you just 11 acres north of Midtown Atlanta, Georgia, and probably just 5 acres in downtown Atlanta, which is about 8/1000ths of a square mile. And so our country expanded its borders through the Great Plains right up to the Rocky Mountain Range and doubled its size, and settlers immediately took up the challenge to move further west. The ink on the Louisiana Purchase had barely dried when President Jefferson put together a group of explorers called the Corps of Discovery to head west into this newly acquired territory and explore it, and to seek a water route in the hopes of being able to navigate ships from one coast to the other. Jefferson tapped his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and Lewis asked his friend, William Clark, to co-lead the expedition. After what they hoped would prove to be thorough preparation, the group set out in the spring of 1804 from St. Louis, Missouri. It was sometime during their trip across the northern Great Plains that the group encountered a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who agreed to act as guide and interpreter for the rest of the expedition. A very fortunate occurrence, as her assistance no doubt helped smooth their journey considerably. A year and a half later, they'd reached the Pacific Ocean in what is now the state of Oregon, where they spent the winter and then began their journey home. Nearly 2.5 years and over 8,000 miles later, they returned to St. Louis as heroes. Unfortunately, though they found many amazing things and dispelled a number of myths about the Western territories, they did not find the water route to the Pacific Jefferson had been hoping for. but they inspired many Americans to venture out and seek their futures in the West. During the time of Lewis and Clark's courageous expedition, Texas was still a part of Mexico, but in 1836 that changed when those tough and independent Texans fought for and won their independence. It was during this war that Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna and a force of Mexican soldiers, estimated to be between 1,800 and 6,000 strong, attacked a small fort near San Antonio, Texas, manned by fewer than 200 Texan volunteers, commanded by James Bowie and William Travis. The brave and tenacious defenders of the Alamo, as this fort was named, held out against impossible odds for 13 days, but were eventually overpowered. Instead of disheartening the Texas rebels, the defeat of the Alamo became their rallying cry, and they fought with renewed vigor, eventually defeating Santa Anna and winning their independence. The Republic of Texas existed as an independent nation for nearly 9 years, but in 1844, President John Tyler began negotiations for them to join the United States of America, and in December of 1845 the deed was done. While the annexation of Texas did not in and of itself cause the United States to go to war with Mexico, the dispute over where the boundary lay between the two did. The United States attempted unsuccessfully to purchase the disputed lands, but in the end, fighting over the border led the United States to declare war on Mexico. The Mexican-American War lasted less than a year and a half. Negotiations for peace began when U.S. soldiers captured Mexico City. These negotiations resulted in the nearly 525,000 square miles that make up most of the current American Southwest, and were purchased by the United States for $15 million, and once again our country's borders expanded westward. All of this acquisition of land in such a startlingly short period of time soon had many people in America talking about the idea of manifest destiny, for it had begun to seem that it was our country's destiny to continue to grow and expand its borders from the east coast on the Atlantic, across the golden grasslands, over the rugged mountains, all the way to the blue waters of the Pacific Ocean, and they began to turn their sights on the Pacific Northwest and the territory of Oregon, made accessible by the long and arduous Oregon Trail. Now, the 2,170-mile-long trail had been in existence in some form since 1811, but it wasn't until 1846 that traffic on the trail increased dramatically. The trail stretched from various settlements in Missouri, across the dangerous American Indian territories of the Great Plains, through the scarce and treacherous passes of the Rocky Mountains, to destinations in the rich farmland of the Willamette Valley, or eventually the gold fields of California. In the 20 or so years beginning in 1840, the wheels from the prairie schooners, the name given to the small wagons carrying the 400,000 or so travelers and their possessions across our continent, would cut deep ruts in the earth. Travel on the trail increased dramatically in 1849 after gold was discovered the year before at Sutter's Mill in the Sacramento Valley of California. This discovery happened at a most fortuitous time for our nation, as it was just days after the treaty ending our war with Mexico that gave us the 525,000 acres of land discussed earlier, including California, of which Sutter's Mill was a part of, was signed. Soon after the discovery, nearly every able-bodied male in San Francisco had headed into the valley to pan for gold. As news of the riches to be found in California spread, thousands of men sold their belongings or left their families and headed west. This influx of people seeking their fortunes and settling in the resultant mining towns, which in turn brought in people hoping to make a living off of meeting the needs of those new miners, significantly increased the rate at which California was settled, possibly prompting it to apply for statehood in late 1849. It is really rather astonishing in hindsight the unusual and unique set of events and circumstances that resulted in our country nearly tripling in size. It is no wonder some people began to believe that it was our manifest destiny. Regardless of what you believe, the West was truly won because of the grit and determination of these early pioneers. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here are some links to some helpful resources, as well as the works used in the creation of this screencast.